My name is Eleanor Grace Mitchell, and I am a 64-year-old widow living in the peaceful town of Willowbrook, Tennessee, and I never imagined that I would be telling you this unbelievable story about what happened after my beloved husband Harold passed away, leaving me alone in our big old farmhouse. Harold and I were married for 41 years, and we had 3 wonderful sons together named Christopher, who is my eldest at 37, and then Jonathan, who is 34, and my youngest, Michael, who is 31, and all 3 have families of their own now living in different cities, but they always come home to visit their mama. Harold was a quiet man who worked as an insurance agent, and everybody in Willowbrook respected him and thought he was the most honest man they ever knew, and I believe that too, because he never gave me any reason to doubt him, not even once. When Harold died 18 months ago, I was completely devastated, and I did not know how I was going to survive without him, because he had been my rock and my best friend since we met at a church social when I was just 22 years old. After the funeral, I tried to keep myself busy around the house, cooking and cleaning and tending my garden, but there was one room I could not enter, and that was Harold's private office near the old cellar door, which he always kept locked, saying it had confidential work documents inside. Last month, I started noticing a strange smell coming from that part of the house, and at first I thought maybe a mouse had died in the walls, but the smell kept getting stronger until I knew I had to do something about it. My neighbor, Betty Lou, recommended a contractor named Samuel Porter who had done work on her barn, and she said he was reliable and honest, which is hard to find these days. When Samuel arrived, he was a sturdy man in his early 60s with silver hair and a friendly face, and he shook my hand firmly and called me ma'am, and I knew he was raised with good manners. I explained about the smell coming from my late husband's locked office, and Samuel said not to worry because he could open the door without causing damage. We walked to the back of the house, and within minutes Samuel had the door open and stale air rushed out, making me step back to catch my breath. Samuel went inside first and turned on the light, and I followed slowly, and what I saw made my heart ache because everything was exactly as Harold left it, with his reading glasses on the desk and his favorite coffee mug next to papers. Samuel started looking around for the source of the smell, checking walls and floors and ceiling, and then he stopped in front of an old bookshelf in the corner, and he said, "Ma'am, I need to move this shelf because something is not right here." And that is when everything started to change, and my whole world began to crumble around me in ways I never expected. Samuel Porter grabbed the old wooden bookshelf with both his strong hands, and he started pulling it away from the wall, and I watched nervously as years of dust flew into the air, making us both cough. When the bookshelf was finally moved aside, I saw something that made absolutely no sense to me, and that was a small door built right into the wall that I had never seen before in all my years living in this house. Samuel looked at me with confusion in his eyes, and he asked me, "Ma'am, did you know this was here?" And I shook my head no, because I truly had no idea that my husband had been hiding a secret door behind his bookshelf all these years. The smell was definitely stronger now, and it was coming from behind that little door. And Samuel asked me if I wanted him to open it, and I said yes, because I needed to know what Harold had been keeping from me. Samuel turned the small, rusty handle and pulled the door open, and what we saw inside made both of us gasp out loud because there was a narrow staircase leading down into complete darkness. Samuel pulled out a flashlight from his tool belt and shined it down the stairs, but we could not see where they ended, and he told me that he was not comfortable going down there without knowing what was waiting at the bottom. I asked Samuel what he thought we should do, and he was quiet for a long moment, and then he looked at me with very serious eyes and said something I will never forget for as long as I live. He said, "Ma'am, I have been doing this work for over 30 years, and I have seen many strange things hidden in old houses, but I have never seen anything quite like this, and I think you need to call your family before we go any further." I asked him why, and he said because whatever is down there has been hidden for a very long time, and you should not face it alone. And that is when he spoke those chilling words that still echo in my mind. He said, "Do not come alone, and bring your sons, because I have a bad feeling about this, and you are going to need their support no matter what we find down those stairs." My hands were trembling as I reached for my phone, and I knew in my heart that Samuel was right, because something about this whole situation felt very wrong. I walked back upstairs to the kitchen and sat down at the table, trying to calm my racing heart before calling my boys, and I wondered what Harold could have possibly been hiding from me all these years. I called Christopher first because he is my oldest, and he has always been the responsible one who takes charge during difficult family situations. And when I told him what Samuel Porter had found in his father's office, he went completely silent on the phone for what felt like an eternity. After a long pause, Christopher said, "Mama, do not go down those stairs and do not touch anything until we get there. And I promise you that all three of us will come home as soon as we possibly can." Then I called Jonathan, who lives in Chicago, and he was shocked and confused by what I was telling him, and he kept asking me if I was absolutely sure about what I saw, and I told him, "Yes, son, there is definitely a hidden door behind the bookshelf, and there is a staircase leading down into darkness, and I have no idea what your father was hiding from us all these years." Finally, I called my youngest son, Michael, who was at work in Seattle when he answered, and he immediately said, "Mama, I can hear in your voice that something is very wrong, and I'm going to drop everything and catch the next flight home because you need us." 3 days later, all three of my sons arrived at the farmhouse, and it was the first time in over 2 years that all of them had been home together at the same time, and seeing their faces gave me so much comfort. Christopher drove in from Nashville, and he arrived first, and he held me tight and told me everything was going to be okay, and that we would figure this out together as a family. Jonathan flew in from Chicago and landed that same evening, and Michael came all the way from Seattle the next morning, looking exhausted but determined to support his mama. Samuel Porter came back to the house that afternoon, just like he had promised he would, and he shook hands with each of my boys and explained in detail everything he had discovered in the office. We all stood together in Harold's office looking at that mysterious hidden door, and my sons could not believe what they were seeing because they had grown up in this house and played in every corner, and none of them ever suspected that this secret room existed beneath their feet. Christopher took a deep breath and ran his fingers through his hair the same way his father used to do when he was thinking hard about something. And then he said, "We need to go down there and find out what Dad was keeping from all of us." Jonathan and Michael nodded in agreement because they knew Christopher was right, and there was no point in waiting any longer. Samuel handed flashlights to each of the boys, and he gave one to me as well, and told us to stay close together and watch our step on the old stairs. Christopher took the first step onto that creaky wooden staircase with his brothers right behind him, and I followed at the back with Samuel beside me in case I needed help. The stairs groaned loudly under their weight, and I held my breath and prayed that they were strong enough to hold all of us. One by one, we descended into the cold darkness below, and the strange smell grew stronger with each step we took, and I gripped the old wooden railing so tightly that my knuckles turned white. Finally, after what felt like forever, we reached the bottom of the stairs, and Christopher shined his flashlight slowly around the room, and what we all saw in that moment made every single one of us freeze in complete and total shock because none of us were prepared for what Harold had been hiding. The underground room was much larger than any of us had expected it to be, and it stretched out in all directions like a small basement hidden beneath the actual basement of our old farmhouse. Christopher moved his flashlight slowly across the dark space, and we could see old wooden shelves lining every wall, and those shelves were filled with cardboard boxes and manila file folders and strange objects that were all covered in thick layers of dust and cobwebs. Jonathan walked carefully along the wall, searching for a light switch, and when he finally found one and flipped it on, several bare bulbs hanging from the ceiling flickered to life, and suddenly we could see everything much more clearly. There were tall metal filing cabinets standing in one corner of the room and a small wooden desk with an old typewriter sitting on top of it, and stacks of yellowed newspapers dating back several decades were piled high against the walls. I could not understand why Harold would need all of this hidden away in a secret underground room, and my mind was racing trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Michael walked over to one of the dusty shelves and picked up a framed photograph that was sitting there, and when he looked at the picture, his face went completely pale, like he had seen a ghost. He slowly turned the photograph around to show the rest of us, and I nearly collapsed right there on the cold concrete floor when I saw what it was, because the picture showed my Harold standing with a woman I had never seen before in my entire life, and that woman was holding a baby in her arms, and Harold had his arm around her shoulder, and they both looked so happy together. Christopher took the photograph from Michael's trembling hands and studied it closely, and he said, "Mama, this picture looks very old, and based on Dad's appearance, I think it was taken before you and Dad were even married." My heart was pounding so hard inside my chest that I thought it might burst right out, and I had to grab on to Jonathan's strong arm just to keep myself from falling down. Samuel Porter stayed quiet in the corner of the room, letting us have this difficult private family moment, but I could see the deep concern written all over his weathered face. We started going through the boxes and files one by one, and with each new discovery, my perfect image of Harold Mitchell shattered more and more into pieces that I knew could never be put back together. There were dozens of letters addressed to someone named Catherine Williams, and when I opened them, I discovered they were love letters written in Harold's own handwriting, and they were dated during the early years of our marriage, when I thought we were so happy together. Jonathan found financial records in one of the filing cabinets showing that Harold had been secretly sending money to an address in another state every single month for over 30 years without ever telling me. Christopher discovered legal documents that revealed the most painful truth of all, and those documents showed that Harold had another family and another whole life that none of us ever knew anything about. The documents we found in that hidden room told a story that broke my heart into a million tiny pieces, and I could barely breathe as my 3 sons continued searching through boxes and files, looking for more answers. According to what we discovered, Harold had met a woman named Catherine Williams several years before he ever met me, and they had fallen deeply in love, and she had become pregnant with his child. Catherine gave birth to a baby girl they named Sarah, and that meant that somewhere out there I had a stepdaughter who would be about 40 years old now, and I never even knew she existed. For reasons that I could not understand from the documents, Harold chose to marry me instead of Catherine, but he never stopped loving her, and he never abandoned his daughter Sarah, not even for one single day. Every month for over 3 decades, my husband Harold had been sending money to Catherine and Sarah to help support them, and that explained why we always seemed to have less money than we should have had based on Harold's good salary at the insurance company. Christopher found more photographs in the boxes showing Harold with Sarah at different ages throughout her life, and he was there for her birthday parties and her high school graduation and even her wedding day. My sons looked at these pictures with growing anger and deep confusion on their faces because their father had missed so many of their own important events over the years, claiming that he had business trips and work conferences. But now we finally knew the horrible truth about where he really was. Michael suddenly grabbed one of the cardboard boxes and threw it hard against the wall in complete frustration, and papers flew everywhere, scattering across the dusty floor, and Jonathan had to physically hold him back and calm him down before he destroyed everything in the room. I understood Michael's anger because I felt that same burning rage inside my own chest, but I also felt something else that surprised me, and that was a deep, overwhelming sadness for this woman, Catherine, and her daughter, Sarah. This poor woman had loved my Harold too, and she had been forced to share him with another family for all those years and live her life hiding in the shadows, never able to claim him publicly as her own. I found myself wondering if Catherine knew about me and my 3 sons, or if Harold had been lying to her the same terrible way he had been lying to us for our entire marriage. Samuel Porter finally cleared his throat and spoke up from the back of the room, and he said, "Folks, I am sorry to interrupt, but there is something else back here that you all really need to see." We followed Samuel to a dark corner of the underground room where a large, heavy object was covered with an old, dusty white sheet, and when Samuel grabbed the sheet and pulled it away, we found ourselves standing there looking at a big metal safe that none of us knew existed. The safe was old and extremely heavy-looking, and it had a combination lock on the front door that none of us knew the correct numbers to open. Christopher stepped forward first and tried punching in Harold's birthday, but the safe did not open. And then he tried my birthday, hoping that Harold had used that, but it still did not work. He tried our wedding anniversary date next, thinking that might have some special meaning to Harold, but once again we heard nothing but silence from the locked safe door. Jonathan suggested that we try the birth dates of the 3 sons one after another, but Christopher tried all of those combinations and none of them worked either, and we were starting to feel frustrated and hopeless. Then I had a sudden thought that made my stomach turn over with disgust and sadness, and I quietly asked Christopher to try the numbers that might be Sarah's birthday, based on the dates we had found in the documents and letters. Christopher looked at me with such sad and tired eyes, and he slowly punched in those numbers, and we all held our breath. And then we heard a loud click as the heavy safe door slowly swung open, revealing what was hidden inside. The first thing we saw inside the safe were thick stacks of cash money that must have totaled tens of thousands of dollars, and my 3 sons looked at each other in complete disbelief because none of us knew Harold had this kind of money hidden away. There were also old gold coins in small velvet bags and pieces of expensive-looking jewelry and important-looking documents that were tied together neatly with rubber bands. Michael reached his hand into the safe and pulled out a large manila envelope that had my name, Eleanor, written on it in Harold's familiar handwriting, and he handed it to me carefully. My hands were shaking so badly as I took the envelope from Michael, and I was honestly afraid to open it because I did not know if my heart could handle any more painful revelations after everything we had already discovered. Christopher put his strong hand gently on my shoulder and said, "Mama, whatever is written in there, we are going to face it together as a family, and you are not alone." I took a deep breath to steady my nerves, and I carefully opened the envelope, and inside I found a long handwritten letter that Harold had written to me, along with several official-looking legal papers. The letter was dated just 1 month before Harold died from his surgery complications, and reading that date made me realize that he must have known somehow that his time on this earth was running short. I began reading the letter out loud so that my sons could hear exactly what their father had to say from beyond the grave, and with each word that came out of my mouth, I felt my emotions shifting from burning anger to deep confusion to something unexpected that I could not quite name yet. The letter continued for several pages, and Harold explained in great detail how he first met Catherine Williams when he was just 20 years old and working his first job at a small grocery store in a town about 50 miles from Willowbrook. They fell in love quickly, the way young people often do, and Catherine became pregnant with their daughter Sarah before they ever had a chance to get properly married. Catherine's family was extremely religious and very strict, and when they discovered that their unmarried daughter was going to have a baby, they were absolutely furious and ashamed. Her parents forced Catherine to give the baby away for adoption against her wishes, but Harold fought with everything he had to keep his daughter Sarah and his life somehow. He tracked down the adoptive family and made a secret arrangement with them to financially support Sarah and be allowed to be part of her life from a distance, even though he could never publicly claim her as his own child. A few years later, Harold met me at that church social, and he told me in the letter that he fell completely in love with me the very first moment he saw me smile at him from across the room. But Harold felt trapped because he could not tell me about Catherine and Sarah and the complicated situation he had gotten himself into because he was deeply ashamed and terrified of losing me. Over the years, the secret grew bigger and bigger, like a monster hiding in the closet, and it became more and more impossible for Harold to confess the truth without destroying absolutely everything he had worked so hard to build with me and our 3 sons. Harold wrote that he created this hidden underground room so that he could have a private place to keep his other life completely separate from our family, and he would come down here late at night to look at photographs of Sarah and write letters to Catherine and feel connected to his first daughter. The money we found in the safe was meant entirely for Sarah, and Harold wanted her to have it after he died because he always carried tremendous guilt in his heart for not being able to be a real, full-time father to her, the way he was for Christopher and Jonathan and Michael. Harold also left detailed instructions in the letter for how to contact Catherine and Sarah because he wanted me to meet them after he was gone, and he desperately hoped that somehow all of us could find peace and forgiveness. My sons listened carefully to every single word of that letter, and I could see the conflicting emotions playing across their tired faces. Because they still loved their father, but they also felt deeply betrayed by all of his lies and secrets. 2 weeks after we discovered the hidden room and read Harold's confession letter, I made a decision that surprised even myself, and I picked up my telephone and dialed the phone number that Harold had left for Catherine Williams. A woman answered on the 3rd ring, and when I said, "My name is Eleanor Mitchell," there was a very long, heavy silence on the other end of the line, and then Catherine started crying softly into the phone. We talked together for over an hour that first time, and she told me her side of this complicated story, and I learned that she had loved Harold very deeply for most of her life, but she always knew in her heart that he truly belonged to me and our family. Catherine said she never wanted to cause any pain to me or my sons, and she had actually told Harold many times over the years that he needed to confess the truth to us, but he was always too afraid of the consequences. She told me all about Sarah and what a wonderful, strong, beautiful woman she had turned out to be, and how Harold had been so incredibly proud of his firstborn daughter, even though he could never publicly claim her or give her his last name. I asked Catherine if she thought Sarah would be willing to meet me and my 3 sons, and Catherine said she would ask her daughter and let me know as soon as possible. 3 days later, I received a phone call from Sarah herself, and her voice sounded nervous and shaky, but also very kind and warm. Sarah told me that she had always known about our family and she had seen photographs of Christopher and Jonathan and Michael throughout her life, and she had often wondered what it would be like to have 3 younger brothers. We arranged to meet at a quiet restaurant in a small town that was located halfway between our 2 homes, and I brought all 3 of my sons with me because I needed their support. When Sarah walked through that restaurant door, I actually gasped out loud because she looked so incredibly much like Harold that it completely took my breath away. She had his same bright eyes and his same gentle smile, and even the way she walked across the room reminded me so much of my late husband that tears immediately started rolling down my wrinkled cheeks. Sarah came over to our table slowly, and we all stood up to greet her, and there was an awkward moment where nobody knew exactly what to do or what to say. Then I simply opened my arms wide, and Sarah fell into my embrace, and we both stood there crying and holding each other tightly while my 3 sons watched with tears streaming down their own faces. Over the next several months, Sarah became a regular and welcome part of our family, and my 3 sons, slowly but surely, began to accept her as their older sister. I will not lie to you and tell you that it was easy at first, because there was so much pain and confusion and lingering anger that needed to be carefully worked through by all of us. Christopher struggled the most with accepting Sarah because he was the oldest of my sons, and he felt like his entire childhood and every memory of his father had been built on a foundation of terrible lies. But eventually, even Christopher came around and started to see that Sarah was innocent in all of this, and she had suffered just as much as we had from Harold's secrets and deceptions. Jonathan was more understanding and forgiving from the very beginning, and he said that holding on to all this anger and bitterness would only end up hurting ourselves, and it certainly would not bring Harold back from the dead or change anything that happened in the past. Michael and Sarah became especially close to each other because they were the nearest in age among the 4 siblings, and they quickly discovered that they actually had many interests and personality traits in common. Sarah told us so many stories about her life growing up with her adoptive parents and how she always felt like something important was missing from her heart because she knew her real biological father was out there somewhere, living another life. She showed us photographs of her 2 beautiful children, who I suddenly realized were my grandchildren that I never even knew existed, and my heart swelled with so much love for these precious little ones. Catherine and I also developed an unexpected and genuine friendship over those months because we came to realize that we were both victims of Harold's inability to be honest and his cowardice in facing the truth. We would talk on the telephone every single week and share our different memories of Harold and try together to understand the complicated, flawed man that we had both loved so deeply. I made the decision to split the money from the safe equally between all 4 children because Sarah was just as much Harold's child as Christopher and Jonathan and Michael were. Samuel Porter came back one last time to properly seal up the hidden room because none of us wanted to keep it open anymore. And before he left my house that day, he told me that in all his years of working, he had never seen any family handle such a terribly difficult situation with as much grace and dignity as we had shown. 1 full year has now passed since that fateful day when Samuel Porter discovered the hidden door behind the bookshelf in Harold's office, and I can honestly tell you that my life is completely different now in ways I never could have imagined. I have 4 children instead of 3, and I have 7 beautiful grandchildren instead of 4, and my family has grown and expanded in ways that still sometimes overwhelm me with gratitude and wonder. We held a small private ceremony at Harold's grave last spring, where all 4 of his children stood together for the very first time as siblings, and we said our final goodbye to the complicated man who had connected all of our lives together. I will not pretend that I have completely forgiven Harold for everything he did, because some wounds cut so deep that they take much longer than a year to fully heal. But I have come to understand now that people are complicated, messy beings, and that Harold was not some evil monster, but rather a deeply flawed and frightened man who made terrible mistakes when he was young and then spent his entire life desperately trying to make things right without ever having the courage to tell the truth. My sons have learned through this painful experience that even the people you love the most in this world can have dark secrets hidden inside them, and that forgiveness is not really about excusing someone's bad behavior, but rather about freeing yourself from the heavy burden of carrying anger and resentment forever. Sarah has truly become like a daughter to me now, and I cherish every single moment that I am blessed to spend with her and her wonderful family. Catherine even came to visit me at the farmhouse last month, and we sat together on my old front porch, rocking in chairs and drinking sweet iced tea and talking about Harold, and actually laughing together at the funny memories we both shared of him. If someone had told me 2 years ago that I would become genuine friends with my late husband's other woman, I would have said that person was absolutely crazy and out of their mind. But life has a strange way of surprising us when we least expect it, and sometimes the most painful and devastating discoveries in our lives can actually lead us to the most beautiful and unexpected blessings. I am truly grateful to Samuel Porter for having the wisdom and the kindness to tell me that day not to come alone and to bring my sons, because facing that hidden room and all those terrible secrets with my boys standing strong beside me gave me the courage and strength I desperately needed. And I am forever grateful for my 3 wonderful sons who stood faithfully with their mama through the darkest and most difficult moments of her life and helped me slowly find my way back to the light and to hope and finally to peace.